For centuries across the islands of Aotearoa, New Zealand, the Maori gathered a sacred red powder from the earth. They dug it from iron-rich clay and stone, they baked it on fire, they ground it fine, and they mixed it with oil until it became a deep, lasting red. They called it kōkōwai, and they used it to colour the most important things they owned. Their great carved meeting houses, their war canoes, their sacred objects, the skin of the living, and the bones of the honoured dead. To picture it, imagine walking into a Maori meeting house 2 centuries ago. The great carved figures of the ancestors loom in the dim light, and they glow a deep, living red, not painted for prettiness, but robed in the colour of the sacred. Everywhere the eye falls on something that truly mattered, it finds that same red. The treasured, the tapu, the connected to the gods. Kōkōwai was the visible sign of what a people held holy. But kōkōwai was never merely painted. To the Maori, this red was not a colour chosen for its beauty alone. It was something far deeper, a substance charged with meaning, tapu, and spiritual power. And in their understanding of the world, the red ochre in the ground had a specific and profound origin. It was the blood of the earth herself, the blood of Papatūānuku, the Earth Mother, soaked into the land at the very beginning of the world. That is the claim in the title, and it is not an outsider's exaggeration or a fanciful legend bolted onto a mineral. It is, faithfully, what kōkōwai meant to the people who used it. When a Maori carver rubbed red ochre into a figure of an ancestor, or when it was laid upon the bones of a chief, they were connecting that thing to the body and the blood of the Earth Mother herself. And it was not unique to one tribe or one corner of the islands. The use of red ochre ran the length of Aotearoa, from the far north to the deep south, woven into the practices of iwi across the land, a shared thread running through a rich and varied culture. To understand how a red powder could carry that weight, you have to set aside, for a moment, the idea of colour as decoration. In the Maori world, and across the wider Polynesian world they came from, the colour red was one of the most powerful things that existed. It was not one shade among many. It was sacred. So this is really 2 stories woven together. What kōkōwai physically was, and how it was made and used, and the cosmology that made a lump of iron-stained clay into the blood of a goddess. Both are true, and neither makes sense without the other. Begin with the colour itself, and why red meant so much. In Maori thought, red was kura, a word that means red, but also means treasure, something precious and prized. To call a thing red was, in a sense, to call it valuable, chiefly sacred. This was an old idea, carried across the Pacific by the ancestors of the Maori, for whom red had long been the colour of rank and of the gods. The roots of this ran deep into the Pacific past. The Maori descended from Polynesian voyagers who had crossed vast oceans to reach Aotearoa, carrying an ancient inheritance of ideas with them. Across Polynesia, red had long been the colour of chiefs, of the gods, and of the sacred, the hue of the most precious things, from red feathers prized above almost any treasure to the ochre of the earth. When Maori treated red as holy, they were continuing something far older than New Zealand itself. And red was bound up with tapu, that central Maori concept of sacredness, of things set apart, restricted, and charged with spiritual force that must be respected. Anything coloured with kōkōwai tended to become tapu. The carving, the canoe, the dwelling of a dead person, the scraped bones of a chief. The red did not just mark these things as important. It made them sacred and therefore dangerous to handle carelessly, hedged about with rules and respect. It's worth pairing tapu with its opposite, noa, the ordinary, the free, the everyday. Maori life moved constantly between the two, and much of ritual was about safely managing the boundary between them. Kōkōwai lived on the tapu side of that line, which is exactly why it was handled with such care. Red also carried mana, the spiritual authority and prestige of chiefs and gods, and it touched Mori, the life force that Maori understood to dwell in living things and in the land itself. Red was the colour of blood, and so of life and death, of birth and war, of the vital force that runs through the world. To wear it or apply it was to align a thing with all of that power. So when a Maori person reached for kōkōwai, they were not choosing a pleasant colour. They were reaching for meaning. The act of laying red ochre on a surface was an act of transformation, marking something as sacred, protected, alive with spiritual force, and connected to the ancestors and the gods. That is the frame you need to hold, and it makes the physical reality of kōkōwai, the digging, the burning, the grinding, not a mundane craft, but a sacred one, the careful making of a holy substance. So how, in practical terms, was the blood of the earth actually made? Stripped to its chemistry, kōkōwai is red ochre. Iron oxide, the mineral hematite, the same substance that has been used to make red pigment by peoples all over the world for tens of thousands of years. In New Zealand, it occurred in iron-rich clays and stone, often in areas of volcanic activity, as seams and deposits stained red, orange, yellow, and brown by the iron within them. Gathering it was only the beginning. Some ochre could be used more or less as found, but the finest reds took work. Maori would take iron-rich clay, tapu, or ochreous earth and bake it in specially built fires. The heat oxidized the iron, deepening and intensifying the colour, transforming a dull earth into a vivid red. The baked material was then ground down, patiently, into a fine powder. There was real skill in every step, judging which clay would fire to the best red, tending the baking fire, grinding the powder to the right fineness, blending it with oil in the right proportion. All of this was knowledge, held and passed down. A poorly made ochre gave a weak, fugitive colour. A well-made one gave a rich red that lasted for generations. The difference between them was the difference between a labourer and a master. That powder could be applied dry, but it was often bound into a paint. Mixed with water, it would colour a surface for a time, but to make it last, Maori mixed the ochre with oil. Most famously, oil rendered from the liver of sharks, or oil pressed from the seeds of the tatoki tree. Bound with oil, kōkōwai became a durable red paint that could hold its colour on carved wood for a very long time, weathering the years. Because good ochre was not evenly spread across the land, a fine deposit of kōkōwai was a genuine treasure, a valuable possession that a group would prize, and that could, at times, spark disputes between tribes over ownership. Some of the places where it was dug were themselves kept tapu, their ochre reserved for the most sacred purposes. This was not a common material lying about for anyone. It was a resource of real economic and spiritual worth. And because the best sources were scattered and unequal, kōkōwai moved. Fine ochre could travel along the trails and trade routes that linked Maori communities, exchanged as the valuable thing it was, a red powder passing from hand to hand across the land, far from where it was first dug. So we have a sacred colour and a valuable, carefully made pigment. The next question is what the Maori actually did with it. And the answer reaches from the grandest carved houses to the walls of caves, and from the living body to the bones of the dead. Kōkōwai was everywhere in Maori life that mattered. It was rubbed into the great carvings, the ancestral figures on meeting houses and storehouses, deepening their red and marking them as sacred. It was painted onto the soaring prows and hulls of the war canoes, the waka, vessels that were themselves treasured and tapu. It coloured weapons, ornaments, and treasured objects of every kind. It was laid, too, upon the body. Smearing the face and skin with red ochre was near universal among early Maori, both as adornment and as protection. It was used in tamoko, the sacred art of Maori tattooing and marking. And it had a practical side that shaded into the spiritual. Mixed with shark oil, kōkōwai helped keep off the biting sandflies, and it was believed to keep away the Papatūānuku, the pale fairy folk of the forests, who were said to dislike its smell. Protection of the body and protection of the spirit came in the same red smear, and it was the colour of the dead. In the deepest reaches of tapu, kōkōwai was applied in the rituals surrounding death, painted on the dwelling of a person who had died, and, most sacredly of all, rubbed onto the cleaned bones of a chief when they were tended and reburied. In red ochre, the living and the honoured dead were touched by the same sacred substance. That the same red touched the living body, the carved house, and the resting place of the dead tells you how completely kōkōwai bound Maori life together. From birth to death, one thread of the sacred, in a single colour, ran through all of it. Kōkōwai is also the colour that survives on stone. In rock shelters and caves, especially across the South Island, Maori and their ancestors left paintings, figures of people, animals, and forms whose meanings are not all were known, drawn in red ochre. Those images, laid down long ago in the sheltered dark, still hold their colour today, one of the oldest forms of Maori art still visible on the land. The red that painted the caves is the same red that painted the canoes and the bones, the blood of the earth laid on stone. Rock art deserves its own moment. In the limestone shelters of the South Island in particular, generations of Maori and their forebears left drawings in kōkōwai, birds, human figures, strange and beautiful forms, some of them very old. These are among the earliest surviving artworks in the country, painted in the sheltered dark with the same red that adorned the canoes and the dead. To stand before them is to see the blood of the earth used as ink, people reaching across the centuries in the one colour that meant the most. Which brings us, at last, to the heart of it, to why this red was the earth's own blood. For that, you have to go back to the very beginning of the world. In the Maori account of creation, told with variations among the many iwi, the tribes, but sharing a common heart. The world begins with two beings locked together in a tight embrace. Ranginui, the Sky Father, and Papatūānuku, the Earth Mother. Between their pressed-together bodies, in the cramped darkness, their children were born and lived, crushed and lightless, longing for space and day. It's important to say that these traditions are not a single fixed text. They were living, spoken knowledge, differing in their details from iwi to iwi, and from telling to telling, a richness, not a flaw. What runs through them is the same profound idea, that the earth is not dead matter, but a living ancestress, Papatūānuku, with a body, a story, and a kinship to the people who live upon her. In that view, human beings are not separate from the land. They are her descendants, made from her flesh. At last, the children resolved to force their parents apart, so that light and life could come into the world. It was a violent, wrenching act, the tearing of the earth from the sky. And in that primal separation, blood was spilled. In the tradition, the blood of the parents soaked down into the body of Papatūānuku, into the earth, and there it became the red ochre in the ground, kōkōwai. The red in the clay was, quite literally in this understanding, the blood shed at the birth of the world, held forever in the flesh of the Earth Mother. There is a second, deeper thread. In the tradition, the first human woman, Hine-ahu-one, was fashioned by the god Tene from the red earth of a sacred place called Kurawaka, the red soil of Papatūānuku's own body. From that red earth, the first person was formed. So the red in the ground was not only the blood of the world's birth, it was the very substance from which humanity itself was shaped, the flesh of the Earth Mother, made into people. Now the pieces come together, and the title stops being a poetic flourish and becomes a plain statement of belief. To paint a carved ancestor, a canoe, a living face, or the bones of a chief with kōkōwai, was to touch them with the blood of Papatūānuku, to connect them to the birth of the world and the making of the first people, to life and death and the sacred power of the land itself. The red was a physical link between a human thing and the body of the earth. Seen that way, kōkōwai is kinship made visible, a way of carrying a piece of the Earth Mother onto the things that hold a people's identity, and of remembering, in the plainest form, where they came from. So both truths hold at once, without contradiction. To a geologist, kōkōwai is haematite, iron oxide, a mineral stain in the clay. To the Maori it is, and remains, the blood of the Earth Mother, soaked into the land at the dawn of everything. A red powder dug from the caves and clay of New Zealand was treated as one of the most sacred substances a people could possess. And now you know why. Because it was, in their world, the earth's own blood, carried in the hand and laid with reverence upon everything that mattered most.